What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I am a game designer on the Summoner's Rift team, so I had a hand in this patch itself and have some first-hand stories to tell as well about it. It's the patch rundown. 13.7 is coming, and that means sort of part one of MSI changes. This one, a lion's share of this patch itself are reacting to trends across the year for pro play. We generally tried to not be too reactive to any individual patch until things hit 100% pick ban. Then we were kind of forced to act, or if things were really OP in solo queue as well. But we sort of tried to let things shake out. I was especially of that opinion throughout bot lane for this patch, where there were pretty few nerfs overall. Caitlyn AD carry and Ashe support were certainly among them. Both those champions at the time were approaching 100% pick ban. But otherwise, I tried to be pretty reserved around how that lane went until things shook out for the end of the year, or at least the end of the split, to the point where eventually, as we'll see here in the rundown, Zeri kind of became the clear #1, but she really wasn't for most of the year, so that's why we kind of waited on that one overall. Anyway, lots to talk about, as there were some champions that remained sort of top end, sort of S tier for the entire split, the entire set of patches. So let's go to 13.7. There are nerfs to Annie, Lee Sin, Olaf, Rammus, Sejuani, Veigar, Vi, Wukong, and Zeri. Vi, Wukong, Zeri, Lee Sin, Sejuani are all specifically pro jungle meta and AD carry meta nerfs. Annie, honestly, really high prio in pro as well. I believe she was the #1 champion for the last couple of patches, but a mid-support flex, and also just overall pretty OP in support for solo queue. Then we have Olaf, who's doing too well in almost all places in solo queue. Rammus, who is specifically a must nerf for low MMR. He's like 54% win rate for the bottom half of players, which is far too high. So looking for a low MMR skewed nerf for him. And then Veigar, who is overall just breaking all kinds of knees around how bot lane is going. The fact that pro players are not willing to play any Veigar bot means they are way too slow to adapt to champions that are actually strong. I know he's a scaling pick, but like, you can find ways around it, is my opinion. Whatever, it doesn't matter. Going to move on from there. Reverting Death's Dance back to the ability haste version with a bit less attack damage. Grievous Wounds update to where it will affect things without breaking a shield. A Rod of Ages technical nerf because of Catalyst change. Abyssal Mask here as well for the same reason. And then buffs to Alistar. Mostly because of pro play that we had some room in solo queue. Azir getting pretty much strictly buffed for this patch as follow-up from the 13.5 changes. Graves and Kalista getting buffed because they've got room in solo queue, especially in the case of Kalista, and also aren't really seen in pro. A very, very, very light reshaped Katarina, but a small buff to her, and a small buff to Yasuo here as well, with a small reshape to Kha'Zix, and what ended up being actually a strict nerf to Thresh. We'll talk about that when it comes down to it. Some new skins here as well, all kind of cool stuff. So let's talk about individual champions. First up is Alistar. I submitted this guy for buffs after the 13.3 support adjustment, and then his follow-up change to 13.4 because I ended up nerfing him on accident. He's been fine. He's been like 49-50% win rate for a pretty long time, for the last couple of months. But ultimately, this is a pretty cool champion. It's good to promote some variety, and honestly, I think buffing any champion up to 51, like for average solo queue play, is totally reasonable, especially if it means, hey, we get to maybe see a little bit more excitement, a little bit more, a couple of more things in pro play overall. So here, just have some simple buffs here for Alistar. So 3 armor and 15 health should be a pretty meaningful buff overall. There is a chance this is too much. Of course, we always have 13.8 to react to changes, and if things were too big, we can always walk things back a little bit. But either way, a fairly minor update to Alistar, and we can talk about the math of that right here. So 15 more health is a pretty obvious 2 to 1% more HP overall. 3 more armor, if you multiply that against his health differences, is a 4 to 2% increase in overall physical durability. His magic durability is here, his physical durability is there. Congratulations, nothing too exciting to talk about, but the fact that, hey, he's tankier, this is going to be win rate up, and we will see if more people want to play Alistar as a result. Annie definitely has to be nerfed. It's worth noting that even for mid Annie, Emax second is her better build compared to Wmax second. This has been true as far as I can tell for the entire history of post minor update Annie. Again, doing too well as support. She's definitely too strong there, so a pretty well-deserved nerf. Ultimately, just nerfing what the value of Emax does to you. Going to lose 2 seconds on the cooldown, as well as 20 points on the shield with no recompense anywhere else. Annie, again, too high of win rate, too strong of a champion, so a pretty strict nerf there. Here is the cooldown before and after. Don't mind the green text. It is a larger number, which means a worse cooldown. I'm just using green to mean bigger, red to mean smaller. And then, of course, the shield, around 7% less shielding once you max it out. Level 9 on Annie does take a while for support. It it's rare-ish that you are level 6 for first Rift Herald, so level 6 at 8 minutes. But again, you slowly gain XP, and eventually you do end up capping the shield out, but it'll take quite some time. So you're going to be in here for a large portion of the game. Just, hey, FYI, that's the breakpoints on the anti-shield. On to the next one. There are paragraphs here for Azir. I have probably spent, I don't know, 4 hours or so at this point recording video about my thoughts on Azir, what's going on. I spent a lot of time in the Azir main subreddit. TLDR, the primary thrust of this patch is strict buffs to Azir. The goal is about 3% positive win rate. If you look at his optimal skill order and his optimal couple of keystones, he's maybe about 47% win rate if you do all that stuff. And so giving him a simple 3%, even 4% would probably be okay, is probably still on the light side for the champion. Basically every champion in the game, if you look at like, hey, what's your correct skill max order, what's your correct keystone, almost all the champions are going to be 51-52% win rate, even if they are balanced. So Azir has room for maybe even more than 3% here, but we are being somewhat moderate. This is one of the MSI patches. It's basically MSI patch version 1, 13.8 gets to be the actual patch that MSI is on. And so there's a little bit of conservativeness here, but ultimately there's a couple of goals. One is, again, strict power, get Azir to a spot where he is at least playable instead of being kind of actively grieving for playing him. I think these changes will accomplish that by giving him enough win rate. Number 2 is trying to signal to players to max W. There's basically an important dichotomy here with Azir as a champion. So Q is a really, really functional tool for repositioning his soldiers and keeping them in range. If that cooldown is too short in the laning phase, there is no counterplay to Azir in the laning phase, because champions aren't very fast, they're not very bursty, they're not very mobile, people don't have boots yet in a lot of cases, and there's not enough damage to like burst this champion back. So if his soldiers are always in range, he's just always in range to auto attack you and push you out of lane, and that's very annoying. But you get to team fights, and he needs the short Q cooldown to keep up with a much more hectic, much more free-flowing team fight, where you're going to be fighting up and down the river and all these things going on, whereas in lane, here's the wave, there's only so many places we can be while still last hitting the wave, and you don't have quite that same requirement on movement. So what that means is his Q cooldown is a very important lever here on the champion. And one of the wins we got from 13.5 was if Azir shifts to W max, then we can actually have a laning phase Q cooldown, which is like ranks 1 to 2 of the ability, whatever that number needs to be, and then a team fight cooldown on the ability, whatever it needs to be in team fights, and those can be distinct numbers and really obvious numbers. What's happened with Live Azir from like 13.3 in the few years prior is that because he maxed Q, you were really close to team fight cooldown movement while still in a laning phase, which meant that like this champion requires sort of low counterplay on Q in team fights, but that's really unhealthy for the laning phase. And so by getting him to go into W max, this actually allows that difference to be stretched out for a longer portion of time. This might mean that over time, Azir's early Q cooldown needs to go down from 14 to like 12 or 10 or something. I'm not sure. Maybe it should scale off character level. There's maybe some more investigation here, but ultimately, a large portion of this patch is giving him enough power that we can then get reads on, okay, now that he's not a garbage champion, now that he's playable and he should be successful in the hands of mains, what really are the matchups here, what really is and isn't working, and kind of going from there and then saying, okay, what else needs to be showed up on the champion? I think if this patch ends up being about 3% of win rate, I think there's about another 2% that Azir can be given before he becomes a huge problem. This is assuming that his pro skew problem has actually been fixed, because Azir, for his life, has been a 45% win rate champion for the bottom half of players while being a 70% pro presence mid laner. And that's really, really stark. It's really, really far apart. And the hope with all these changes from 13.3 to 13.4, 13.5 onwards is how much can we shore up this 50% pro pick ban and this 45% win rate? Can it get 48, 49, 50? Where can we go? And seeing what levers work, what levers still make Azir a fun champion. And ultimately, hey, if he's not garbage right now, we get a better read and we can kind of move on from here. So, 3 armor and 1% attack speed growth. These are basically the strict buffs to Azir. Actually, there's one more to talk about. So 3 armor and 1% attack speed growth. The passive living 15 seconds longer. Keep in mind that this passive used to be 60 seconds before the update in 13.5. So it is splitting the difference here. The cooldown is still halved, so it is a still relatively short cooldown on the passive. Keep in mind that that cooldown only ticks once this thing actually dies. It also is unaffected by ability haste, so it remains fairly long. That's something that could change theoretically down the line, but regardless, because the way his passive works is that the health decays every second based on the expected duration. This is functionally a health increase as well as a duration increase to the passive overall. Cast range go to 700 simply lines up with his cast range of summoning his turret, lines up with his would-be attack range to attack that turret if it were alive. So this isn't meant to be a lot of power, but hey, the passive was updated. I wanted to try what a shorter duration, shorter cooldown, just sort of more active version of this passive was. I liked a lot of what happened there. The damage is up slightly. The rules got simplified. It applies spell effects. Like, there's a lot that really went well there. But hey, this cast range was actually a suggestion from our Azir mains. I liked it. It was a good suggestion. I found that a cast range that, to me, made sense for Azir as a champion that kind of lined up with his animations and everything else. I was happy with that change. And then again, just finding a middle ground of the duration where it's like, I really don't think this thing should be a minute long, but having it last long enough that it feels good and feels like it's at least protective. The other strict buff is here on W, basically, where the total magic damage goes from 50 at level 1 to 200 at level 18. It is now going to be 50 at level 1 and 210 at level 18. So it's a 10 damage increase on a rise, which you will hit by around level 10 or 11, and you'll kind of keep that plus 10 damage from there on out, but a small reshape to how his damage comes in. The other thing is a whole bunch of stuff to recommend to players that they should be maxing W first. This gives us a much healthier champion. Again, I talked about the difference in a Q cooldown that is fair for the laning phase and a Q cooldown that is fair for team fights. It needs to go down to 6 seconds by late game, maybe even a bit shorter, but it can't go shorter if he's getting that during the laning phase, and so enforcing W max allows room for Q buffs, and if Azir needs more buffs, that might be where we go with it in the future. The rest of these are changes around that fact. So, hey, W goes down with cost and rank up. Q goes up in cost even more with rank up, shifting that power towards W. The fact that W goes from plus 10 per rank to plus 17 per rank, again, shifting more power towards maxing W. This is a very minor nerf here, but it was one thing that I noticed while messing around, spending a lot of time looking at how Azir functioned and looking at everything else. This Q stab range actually is higher than his W stab range, so it would create situations where you could Q and the Q would deal damage, but you couldn't actually auto them. If you right-clicked them by seeing the slow hit, by seeing the damage, you would then start walking forward to use a basic attack onto them. There's obviously a strict nerf to how much damage it could deal, but also Q has about 1200 reach, so it's still a relatively, actually, a very long-reaching skill, considering it has no cast animation, and it starts at 500 units away from you, so Q is a relatively unfair spell, but if the damage goes down, if the cost is relatively high, it's more of a resisting tool, and that's pretty solid. So again, there probably can be more cleanup to the champion down the line, but again, mostly strict buffs to the champion and enforcing and shifting players towards W max. So let's go ahead and do some math on what has happened with Azir overall. So here is his armor change. It is 3 more armor. That is a 3 to 1% durability increase. We can show decimals here. You can see 2.5 to 1.5% durability increase against physical damage. As a curiosity, because his base health changed back in 13.4, I was curious actually, because obviously his base health just went down by 72. It went from 622 to 550. Because his armor growth went up and now his base armor went up, I was actually curious what his physical damage durability is comparing 13.3 to 13.7. And it's actually, I would argue this is probably still a nerf overall, weaker for the first 8 levels than higher for the last 10. But actually, it's interesting to note that indeed he actually is in the green in terms of physical damage taken before dying. So in terms of fighting Yasuo and Zed and whatnot, once you basically get to about Mythic, you're actually tankier than you were before, which I think is interesting and just kind of worth noting. Obviously, again, his magic damage durability is strictly down. The next thing is the mana cost change. This is assuming you're already W maxing. WMAX was about 2% higher win rate in patch 13.5 and 13.6. It remained relatively flat there. People slowly started getting more and more onto WMAX as time went on. As ELO went up, players were more likely to go into WMAX, and it basically just retained the 2% win rate gap the entire time. So that was a pretty significant portion of actually his win rate sort of loss in 13.5 was the proper skill order had actually changed, and the vast majority of players had not caught up. So again, part of the reason why we're trying to enforce this, but if you look at the total mana cost of pressing W and then pressing W plus Q, very similar numbers here in the first few levels. Mana cost is actually lower for the chief section of the laning phase, like exactly level 2, your WQ combo is more expensive, but from levels 5 through 11, WQ combo is cheaper, sometimes substantially so. And then once you're level 13, which is you're basically on 2 items, you've got your mana mythic done already. Some Azirs go tier, it's pretty rare, but there's some who do it, some who go Sarah's second item. Technically mana cost a little bit higher, but also keep in mind that in 13.5 his mana growth went up a little bit. It was more mana at level 17, 18. It's not really a buff here, but by this point he's basically going to ignore mana cost, so it shouldn't be a very large nerf. This is basically just there as, hey, an incentive to, again, consider going to WMAX as a champion. Overall, like down the line, allowing Qmax is a maybe, but again, that dichotomy of how often how often your Q is up in lane versus how often it's up in team fights, something that I definitely have my eye on quite a bit there. Moving on though, we have Azir's attacks per second. This is the attack speed growth gain. This is using his plurality rune page, which so if you take basically what is the most common rune at every single slot, this is basically running the attack speed, right, on the stat chart at the top, and then running Legend Alacrity is the most common rune from there, and so using those as sort of baseline attack speed that he's getting, but otherwise no Nashor's Tooth, no Berserker's Greaves, no Lethal Tempo, because none of those are as popular as the other options. Those are all pretty good. So this is the, again, his plurality, his most common build possible, comparing 13.6, 13.7. His attacks per second slowly goes up to about 8% more attacks per second. So 1.5 with again, no attack speed investment other than Legend Alacrity and a stat shard. Pretty reasonable attack speed overall for the champion. That's actually pretty solid. Keep in mind, you can go Zerk Greaves, you can go Nashor's, you can go Lethal Tempo, so there are ways to get a lot more attack speed on the champion overall. With the W damage increase as well, again, considering or expecting WMAX, technically 2 less damage here at level 2, but you can see the damage goes up and up and up and up, and especially kind of a power spike around level 9 or so, where it's about 6% more damage. This is counting the ability power ratio here as well, but you can see that, 382 damage per hit, 1.5 times per second is a pretty meaningful damage increase, right? 8% more attack speed, 3% more damage. Pretty solid stuff here. You get 5% over here as well, so obviously a DPS increase to go with the durability increase from this one as well. These are the, of course, strict buffs. Here is the actual math on Azir. W DPS accounting for ability power. Again, not accounting for any attack speed biases. He doesn't typically commonly buy them right now. And it pretty quickly approaches 10% more DPS. And pretty quickly, right? Because okay, level 1 is the exact same champion. Level 2 is technically down, but it's not for very long. It takes you about a wave to get out of there. And then it quickly approaches, 5, 3, 8. And then by level 7, before your first mythic, you're solidly at 10% more damage just at all points in time anymore. The early spike in damage per hit is then moved over to the attack speed growth carrying over, and he just has a solid 10 to 11% more DPS with W for the vast majority of the game. From about minute 7 or 8 onwards, you just have 10% more W DPS, which is a pretty big buff, right? 10% more damage is a really big deal. The one I will keep harkening back to is if you look at Xayah in 13.1, because it was just the only change made to that champion, Xayah got a 5.3% more total attack speed at all points in time, and that was 2.5% win rate. Now, there's other interaction with the kit, right? If you get more feathers out, that is actually more E damage as well. Has no interaction with the Q, has no interaction with the R, doesn't have interaction with QE, but again, if your W is up, there's some stuff there. But that is a decent, sort of like a little landmark where, hey, giving an AD carry 5.3% more DPS, just flat across all points in time period. That's the number, no matter what. That ended up being 2.5% win rate. So if this is 10% more DPS, now maybe more of Azir's power budget is in the Q slow. Maybe more of Azir's power budget is in the R shuffle. Maybe more of Azir's power budget is in non-attack related DPS stuff, like it's just WQ auto once, and you're gonna have this change, not this change, right? There's a bunch of conflicting factors here, but if Xayah is a direct one-to-one comparison, this is almost 4% win rate. Again, it's somewhat apples to oranges, but this is a very meaningful DPS increase considering that Azir's primary output is in fact soldier DPS. I ran a quick math thing, by the way, and looked at what is Azir soldier DPS with I think it was 3 soldiers out, and Azir with 3 soldiers auto-attacking champion was the same DPS as Cassiopeia landing perfect QEEEE with perfect human reactions and never missing a skill shot. So his DPS actually mirrors a very, it was within 2%, very, very closely mirrors Cassiopeia DPS. So did like a quick just like math check. Hey, by the way, how does this compare? And really actually quite good against other DPS mages. Obviously, Caspia can miss Q. People can run away from Azir Q, you know, out of range. There's obviously other comparisons and whatnot going on, but hey, I did a quick DPS check, and that's about where he lives, which I think is pretty fair, right? Like, these are DPS mages, and they live in a pretty similar DPS spot. Here's some extra math because I was kind of curious about it. This is comparing his WDPS back to 13.3 before any of these changes happened. So level 1, level 2, his WDPS is indeed lower than before, but you can see that it's a really, really solid, like, again, if you go into WMAX, which is new Azir, up to 35% more DPS, but solidly, you know, 10 to 25% more DPS by late game if the ability was actually maxed. So definitely, you know, DPS up if you weren't getting 3 soldiers active. This is like very clearly more damage with the 3 soldier buff of the old Azir. It's going to depend on what point in time you are into the game. Of course, 3 soldier buff wasn't on at all points in time. It's up to you to decide how much that was up versus how much it wasn't. But, you know, a good, healthy amount of green as well as red over here means this is, I would say, relatively flat in a lot of cases. Of course, keeping in mind that this build, the 13.7 Azir, does not have the same Q cooldown that 13.3 Azir did. So, though the DPS is higher, of course, you're in range less frequently. You've got a better passive turret. Your durability is equal-ish against physical, lower against magic, and, you know, again, you know, quite the reshape on the champion, keep in mind, but arguably DPS up as a champion overall as a result of all these changes, with the fact that also Lethal Tempo and Berserker's Greaves and Nashor's Tooth is a better item on the champion overall. So, again, we'll see what it does, but these are the sum result of the changes to Azir, and there is the math, so there you have it. That's pretty much it for these gear changes. Again, the goal is anywhere between 3 and maybe even 5% win rate. 5 would be maybe a bit lofty and probably not what we're actually going to hit. And actually, to be fair, not quite the goal. And with always, the goal with live balance is to react to the game state as it is. If Azir ends up being a 54% win rate top laner, then his armor buffs have to go back away because top lane is very physical heavy. Renekton should have a chance at some point against him, have to kind of revisit some of that stuff, but at the same time, if he can't function in mid because he isn't good enough against ranged champions, then, you know, early Q cooldown can go down, and there can be some reshapes there to, you know, skew mid versus top lane power and whatnot. So we'll see what happens, right? There's the consideration about what happens in top lane, consideration about what does matchups look like in mid, but hopefully the end result is still going to be that he has a much higher resting win rate. He feels good to play, and he isn't a pro problem, right? Hoping for those 3 things to all be true, and that's the goal with Azir. Moving on to the next one, we have Graves. Graves, I think, is very exciting as a champion. I've been playing him in playtest. Having better crit actually feels really, really good. This is not as big of a buff as you might think, but either way, yeah, I am glad to see Graves moving back towards critical builds. I think overall that is a better place for the champion than Gore Drinker Bruiser stuff. You know, I would rather this guy do cool Gale Force stuff, Infinity Edge stuff. Like, I think it's just kind of cooler as a champion overall. So his crit builds are getting strictly better because the damage is up on his crit. By the way, this ends up being 120 becomes 130 basically. This is a 1/12 damage increase to crit builds. His autos just do 1/12 more damage when he critically strikes before compared to after. Obviously a 20 then 10 then 0 second cooldown buff on his R also going to be fairly meaningful as well. This ends up being quite early skewed, and I mean, honestly, it's felt really good. I've played him a few times since this change, and yeah, champs felt really good. So here is Graves' auto attack damage. Again, 1/12 higher is going to be something like this. But this is, I believe, if I did my math right, how much damage you do if you land every single pellet onto a champion in functionally melee range. Now, it is very, very hard to land all 6 pellets onto a crit. This is really, really unlikely. This would be, you know, a full build, functionally 6 items Graves. Not IE. I didn't include that because that didn't feel like it was appropriately part of the math calculation here. But theoretically, how much damage a fully melee range crit can deal. Because it's going to be like something like double your total AD and then multiplied by, I think it's like 1.3 or so when you crit. So, you know, 2.6 times your total AD is quite a lot, right? So something around there is what the numbers are. R cooldown, of course, lower as well. So pretty substantial Graves buffs. He definitely could use the help overall for solo queue. His threat is not great, but I think this is a pretty nice buff, and we will definitely see Graves back. I think for pro play, though, I'm really happy to see more types of junglers. We have been really heavily in a crowd control jungler only kind of metagame, right? Okay, other than Lee Sin, which is a really cool champion, and you know, I'm glad he's around. But Vi, Sejuani, Wukong, There's one more and I'm blanking on it. But there actually no, it was Sejuani Wukong. I mean, Lee Sin showed it because I buffed him a few patches ago. But it's been like Sejuani Wukong as top 3 for like basically ever, other than when Maokai was OP. And Maokai was OP for everybody. Other than that, it's just been like those champs forever. People never got off them. They only want to play control junglers. So buffing in some non-CC I'm a carry jungler instead should spice up pro play a bit. Some teams will try Graves out. I've been lobbying recently for some other carry jungler buffs here for 13.8. We'll probably get a few in. Spoilers on 13.8. We're going to probably buff a few more damage-oriented junglers for 13.8. Those who have room for solo queue without breaking the game. So stay tuned for that, but gonna shift in that direction somewhat. Next is Kalista. We are overly, incredibly, very, very cautious on Kalista. This is the kind of champion where it can go from 0% pick ban to 100% pick ban really, really quickly in pro play. So these buffs are overly cautious, as well as a feels good change that was recommended to me by one of the other designers, and I figured out how to do it. So the overly cautious change is a hopefully low MMR skewed attack damage growth buff here for Kalista. Weird stuff here with Kalista. So on average, we have it pegged that 0.3 attack damage growth should be about 1% win rate for an AD carry. However, with Kalista, she on the one hand only gets 90% total AD on hit when she auto attacks, but both Q and E have a total AD ratio, meaning somewhat uniquely to Kalista compared to other AD carries, this actually is an increase to her Q and E damage as well, which is a pretty big deal, and it means this is probably a larger buff than one might think, comparing it to someone like Tristana or maybe even Ezreal, where a lot of his other outputs don't care about his base AD. Yeah, his Q does, but his W, his E, his R do not. So a consideration here that, hey, this might end up being a little bit scary. Again, going for the smallest buff that felt like it was a real buff and would make people actually look and say, hey, maybe I want to play Kalista here. We'll see what happens. In general, growth stats will tend to be low MMR skewed. I would love to shore up some of Kalista's MMR skew. It's certainly not at this point mastery. This champion is super, super old, around 10 years or so. But hey, if we can find ways to very, lightly get rid of the huge cliff between low and high MR in the champion, that would generally be a positive overall. So going in that direction. As for the passive, this actually ended up being pretty fun to investigate overall. But what it comes down to is instead of Kalista throwing her spear on the ground and then getting to walk away for the next basically 8 seconds while her teammate is rooted in place, then dies, then gets up, then does whatever. Now Kalista throws the spear down. She then channels on the spear while her target goes through the death animation, and the whole thing takes 8 seconds. You are now both rooted for all 8 seconds instead of her target being rooted for 12 and her being rooted for 4. That is basically the change overall here. It was interesting figuring out which abilities did what, how stuff worked out. If you want to hear more of the story, I have a different video. It'll be one of the more recent ones on my channel about the sort of patch preview to 13.7, and I went through how this ability is coded and how it works and whatnot. But I think this should overall be a pretty big feels win because the whole ceremony is a lot faster, and I think just overall is going to be a positive for a lot of people. We can look at the math here on Kalista's base AD, and it's up, 0 to maybe 3% base AD. Of course, she will buy attack damage out as well, but that's the math there. Again, looking for maybe 0.5 to 1% win rate. Katarina, I did not do a bunch of extra math on. It's simply a 5% AP ratio increase on her passive. Death Lotus gets a very small 2% AD ratio decrease, but an increase to the AD ratio per bonus attack speed. This is basically to tread water on things like Blade of the Rune King. It is very, very slightly powered down on Divine Sunder without any accompanying attack speed. So Divine Sunder or Titanic Hydra, right, would just be a strictly weaker build compared to pre-patch. A small buff to AP. Want to point out that Katarina is, I believe, top 3 champions in the game for average champion mastery when loaded into the Rift, something like that. I forget the exact metric, but she's top 3 in terms of actually mains play her. And so if we're balancing champions around like the 80% skill curve or whatever, where it's like, hey, if you get 80% of the way there, we're gonna line up every single champion so at 80% of the way to the top of the curve, everyone has the same win rate. Katarina have the highest win rate in the game. Like, she would just be 53 chilling because people are beyond that point on average. So just FYI, Katarina may be a frustrating champion. That's maybe an accurate, true statement. She does resets. She's very, very agile. She can dodge a lot of skill shots. She's certainly very, very skillful, but she is, I believe, top 3 most mastered champions in the game, and I believe just deserves the high win rate. I'm a really big believer in essentially paying players off for their mastery. It's actually part of why I try to do these Azir changes back in 13.3, 13.4, 13.5, 13.7, is because even accounting for champion mastery, Azir is still not a 50% win rate champion for most players in most skill brackets, and it's like that, like compared to someone like Cassante or maybe a Phelios, where it's like, no, people aren't really high matched as champion yet. They actually deserve their somewhat low win rate because people actually haven't mastered them, and they're the really big brain champions. People have mastered Katarina and deserve the win rate. And I can like look under the hood at like what is the mastery rate of Azir and be like, okay, this champ should have room, and yet he's stuck in pro play. So anyway, extra context around Katarina, extra context around Azir. Let's move forward. Kha'Zix is another one I didn't do any math on because there's nothing really to math out here. But some nice changes, I think, to try to push him away from the default best build being just evolve W, become a slow bot, become a poke bot. More around, hey, you have extra time to recast your R to find the stealths and find the cool plays during team fights. A shrunk isolation range on a Q to make that one a bit better and more reliably get some targets you can kill. I think these are really, really clever changes. I think it's really smart changes. I'm glad these are happening. I think these are really good changes to Kha'Zix overall. Hopefully get to shape him back into Assassin and not a poke bot, because if Kha'Zix is a poke bot, it's obviously not the kind of kit people actually want when they pick Kha'Zix, right? So I think good things here. Next is Lee Sin, who happy and sad is the #1 jungler in pro play. Lee Sin got a lot of buffs back in 13.3 or 13.4. I was happy with the buffs that we found for him. I got a lot of feedback and a lot of guidance on finding the right ones, and I'm very happy with what we landed on. I implemented, but again, a lot of help from the team and getting the right buffs on. And it actually solved a lot of his win rate by MMR skew, by giving him functionally just better late game overall. Of course, Lee Sin now being the #1 jungler. We definitely wanted to nerf Sejuani, Vi, and Wukong for staleness, but they were the #2, 3, and 4 jungler in pro. There's no way we can't also nerf Lee Sin then in a world where we're just leaving him as #1. He is, I would argue, one of, if not the most exciting jungler, so I do want him to remain in the meta. So, we hope these buffs aren't going to be too large, but overall, -2 AD, -2 armor to Lee Sin. Very simple changes, of course, down to the champion, but let's see what happens with Lee Sin here. Here is his base AD before and after. Here is his base armor and thus his physical durability before and after. This is probably going to be over 1% win rate down. He should still be a playable champion, of course, but again, we can always measure what happened, and if any of these changes are too much, we can always walk them back. I think Lee Sin is a champ that, I believe he should always be like a top 10 pro jungler at all points in time. He's just one of the more exciting champions, and in terms of pro play, right? Unless we want to play whack-a-mole forever, I think it's correct for Riot to curate pro, right? I mean, this has happened forever. This is like deleting things like lane swaps back in like 2014, 15 or whatever, because it was just way too boring to watch, and it was really bad for the spectator sport. And so, like, yep, just killed lane swaps, just gave turret fortification to top and mid lane for the first 5 minutes and said nope, or 3 minutes or whatever the timer actually is. It's like, nope, y'all got a lane bot. And then it's like 1 game and 4,000 is a lane swap. And it's like, cool, great. Now it's exciting and interesting and new and a strat people opted in for. And the rest of the game is the regular game of League of Legends and like generally a positive. So, overall pretty happy about that. Again, we can always revisit Lee Sin if the buffs are too big or too little or whatever. We do want an exciting, discoverable pro meta. I think is exciting. If players go to MSI and they don't know what people are going to pick, that's a good thing. That's a cool thing, because then all the picks are exciting. The games are cool, and the meta isn't solved. That's a good thing overall. So again, small nerfs to Lee Sin. Olaf is finally coming for solo queue. His ban rate really just wasn't climbing. I saw a lot of complaints on Reddit about how Olaf is OP. Why isn't Riot nerfing him? And it's like, his win rate is fairly high, but not like abusively so. And his ban rate has been single digit in every elo bracket worldwide for this entire time. So as much as like there are the occasional Reddit comment of Olaf is OP, very, very few players are actually banning Olaf. There's another top laner or jungler or whatever that people are banning instead, which means not that many people are really that offended by Olaf, because they would ban him if it was a big enough deal for them, right? And there's plenty of gems that we see their ban rate will climb based on win rate. Like Veigar, his ban rate has skyrocketed because people realize that Veigar is very, very good. And there's a ton of champions like this where this happens. Malphite's ban rate is climbing, right? Like, then he could be nerfed, of course. People are also not doing a good job counterpicking him. Whatever, moving on from here. Either way, Olaf definitely is overall too strong. He's been sitting at a high win rate for several patches. It is totally a reasonable nerf to go for, of course. just, I thought it was interesting of like the Reddit comments of like, Riot's playing favorites or whatever. It's like, well, I mean, he's like kind of strong, and people aren't banning him, so we could wait. And okay, anyway, so a bit less attack speed in the early game and 5 flat damage off Undertow. These are both early game focused nerfs. Olaf's win rate is higher in high MMRs than low MMRs. Early game tends to be overrepresented in higher MMRs, so I think there's a well-targeted nerf here as well. Here is the maximum attacks per second allowed to Olaf with just his passive and his base stats. And so it is up to, 6% less attack speed in the early game, tapering down and down and down to the champion level 18. As far as his actual Q damage itself, approximating for pretty high AD builds, but level 18 is another solid 6% or so damage down. Keep in mind the skill has like a 3-second cooldown if you're picking up axes and going again, so a lot of his rundown damage is certainly down, and this will be felt. This should be quite a lot of win rate down, and I think reasonable to do so. Rammus, this is a nerf I got first try. Rammus was basically a must nerf because of his lower MMR win rate. I grabbed it, and this was my version 1 changes. People were like, yep, sounds good, let's do that. Basically, I was trying to find things on the kit that scale really hard at the character level, that scale really hard towards late game, because so I would like a world where Rammus is actually relatively fair for high and low MMR. Like, we got part of that way with a Mumu, for example. Like, we saw a Mumu in pro play, like, on purpose, and it wasn't from high. So, like, hey, we gotta, we got kind of the point where it's like, oh, this champion is unskewed enough to where he is an occasional pro-viable jungler, while still being a bit too good, to be fair, for the bottom half of players in solo queue, but, like, that was an unheard of sort of amount of elo skew crunching. And so if we can get kind of Rammus in that direction as well, I think that'd be a cool thing, where he gets to be like a 51, 52% win rate champion for, average players, but, playable in case you see a bunch of high AD team compositions and like, oh, we've already, locked in not Malphite for top lane, so we don't really have that ability. Oh, well, it's a Rammus comp. Cool. Okay, sounds good. And he gets to kind of show up out of nowhere as the anti-5 AD, tank jungler. Like, that'd be a cool thing for pro play. I think... Like, I don't want a Rammus meta in pro play, but it'd be cool to see Rammus in pro play once in a while. Anyway, targeting nerfs that should be aiming at lower MR play, as late game tends to mean more for that band of players. So for most players, you do not max W until the very, very end. Though that said, at the very end, you do lose 10% of your armor, because you go from 200% total armor to 180% total armor. So that is a pretty meaningful nerf, of course, overall to the champion. But there's actually there were some games, around like 5-10% of all games on Rammus, we were actually seeing W max first, because he was, like, now that Q's rank up goes from 100 total damage to 200 total damage, Q's rank up is pretty bad. You only get cooldown and a bit of damage out of it, so people were W maxing and getting a ton of extra armor and having a ton of extra Thorns damage as a result, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, but it also means, what was interesting is I compared that in low elo to high elo, and it was actually a dominant thing in low elo, but not a dominant thing in high elo. It seems like just the Thorns ability is a low elo skewed thing, though still, again, this champion nearly doubles his armor total, and is very, very durable and very Thornsy as a result. But, slightly tapping that down while still making him a very high armor champion, I think is reasonable. And anyway, a low elo skewed, hopefully, nerf to Rammus here. Sejuani is, once again, a pro jungle nerf here. A couple of small things. So damage cap against epic monsters. I believe she does not have a damage cap against large monsters. This did not get implemented, and still isn't here. But her ability to kill Herald fast, to kill Dragon fast, to blitz these things down is getting capped a little bit lower, a little bit slower. I think it's actually a pretty clever nerf. It's not a big deal. It doesn't get in the way. It's going to be pretty low win rate impacting, but considering how much that rushing these things down can matter in pro play, I think it's actually a pretty cute nerf, and I would say a little bit pro skewed as a result, and I think this is a cool change. Simple 1-second cooldown nerf on Arctic Assault, and a simple 10-second cooldown nerf on Glacial Prison. Certainly all very simple nerfs, but that's fine. This is kind of the goal of these sort of quick reaction changes. Just simply bring win rate down. Not a whole lot to say about here, but the cooldown, again, up 1 second, up 10 seconds here, about 7-ish%. I think totally reasonable nerf, and should, lower Sejuani very slightly in the tier list. Next is Thresh. Very, very happy with the 34 changes on Thresh to enforce Qmax. I say enforce, but I think it's actually correct. Qmax was his worst maxed skill for the last several years. You were meant to max Lantern, even you could max Flay, and that was fine. And it's like, no, please, like, Thresh is the cooler champion when he is Qmax. And I looked at, like, what is Thresh doing at 13-3? And it's like, oh yeah, here's Core JJ maxing Lantern first. And it's like, this champ should not be a Lantern bot. This guy should be the cool hook guy. And so 13-4 did that pretty well. Thresh has enjoyed around like a 25-ish% pro presence since these changes. That's been pretty cool overall. I mean, Thresh in pro play is awesome. I think it's been overall really positive. Very happy to see it. However, this was kind of expected, and it finally showed up. The chain hook ability of the 3-second cooldown refund with the Q cooldown baseline being 9 seconds, mean you have a 6-second cooldown on your Q. They are stunned for 1.5 seconds of it, and ability haste only affects one of these two things. Now, there is a world where this cooldown should just be affected by ability haste. Okay, fair point. But that wouldn't actually get us all the way to where we want to go, I'm pretty sure. And also, the way Thresh Q cooldown is, like, the refresh is hooked up is really weird, and basically, we decided to make this change to somehow lower his chain hookiness, the chain CC ability, too late in the patch to go for a risky change, and so I just simply changed the number by 1 second and moved on. At some point, we could rescript the Thresh Q and make it look up the place in the right things, and there's much that can happen here, but again, it's actually pretty spaghetti under the hood, so not doing that right now. Either way, this basically is a pretty substantial increase in the amount of time your opponents have to breathe between death sentence 1 and death sentence 2. So here is the data table on Thresh's Q actual cooldown with this nerf. At higher ranks, it doesn't really change very much here, but at lower ranks, or at lower levels, higher up in the graph, but going from a 6-second cooldown to 7-second cooldown is a very, very big change, of course. That's a pretty big, meaningful thing, and it's an extra 1 second where everyone has a chance to move. The bigger, scary one is this, where you get 50 haste, you get like cooldown boots, you get a mythic, you get like one other item, and suddenly you're at 50 haste with a stat shard, and it's like, oh, actually, this Q had a 3-second cooldown, again, of which you are stunned for 1.5 seconds of it, which means if there was ever a dark binding, you just got hooked into dark binding, into hook, into flay, into someone else probably stuns you, and you literally couldn't play League of Legends. So making this breathing room up to 4 seconds is a pretty substantial difference here, of course. 1 more second of breathing room to not get chain CC'd by is a very big deal, and definitely an important thing to implement. So this is a strict nerf to Thresh, of course, but he's also got the winner to spare. He's actually in a pretty strong spot now overall, and I don't believe this will actually wreck Qmax. It should still be a good skill order for him, but hey, just FYI, that's the math. Veigar has been overtaking the bottom lane. He's certainly very good in mid as well. We even see pro play out of him, and this is a low elo skewed champion because he's a scaling champion. The fact that we're even seeing Veigar in pro play, this champ is definitely a bit too good. And again, especially, unfortunately, really, really bot lane skewed. So there's this weird, difficult crossroads where, okay, he's low MR skewed, which means more, like, a lot of his power is deferred to late game. So we could theoretically worsen his late game and buff his early game to, like, bring up high elo, bring down low elo. However, he is a bigger problem. Like, he has higher win rate in bot lane than he is in mid lane. Bot laners don't get as many levels as mid laners do. Shocking, I know. A really, really incredible twist of events there. And it's like, well, shoot, these are at odds with one another. So ultimately said, okay, well, we're not going to fix Veigar's MRSU. That's a problem for another day. He is definitely doing too well in the bottom lane, so let's make those champion levels matter. What's also interesting here, actually I like this change a lot. Technically, Emax Veigar is higher win rate, Emax second is higher win rate than Wmax second Veigar, and it's by kind of a lot. It's a pretty substantial win rate difference. And however, most players, they see Veigar, they see big magic damage mage guy, and like, oh, I'll max my other damage spell second. That makes sense. That's like the obvious choice. But turns out that Event Horizon being up more often is actually the stronger option. So I'm actually kind of glad to say, hey, even if it just like it brings them closer together, maybe it does make W overtake. Again, I'm a big fan of fantasy wins. It's why I went so hard on making Thresh Qmax like the right option, the best option, because like that is his coolest ability. Veigar maxing his damage skills first is also like the coolest versus champion, is supposed to be being a stun bot. So I think even directionally is a really good change. So anyway, the Q and W and R ability powers scale with rank. You can no longer hide the E by putting it inside of walls. I think that's a good change there as well. So let's talk about the math behind this. So here's Veigar's Q damage, and in every single case, rank 4 the ability is the same AP ratio, and rank 5 is higher. Well, you have to go ahead and finish maxing Q. I would argue this is probably a slight buff for the champion overall. Very early game, you have very little AP. This will change your last hit ability a little bit. But he might not have that much AP early on, so you're not going to feel it this badly. This is, lost chapter and some number of stacks, sure, but again, I feel like this is not going to be too big of a deal. This one matters a whole lot more. Your 1.08 AP ratio becomes a 0.7 AP ratio. That will definitely be felt, and it's going to be a nerf for a very large portion of the game. I want to point out, actually, that nerfing W ends up being, I believe, a bot lane skewed thing, because my understanding watching Veigar's play is like Veigar in mid lane is pretty low agency, and he kind of just laughs with Q and just kind of does what he can to scale up and just be a team fight menace. And like, okay, that's reasonable, but it's like pretty inoffensive. He just kind of sits there and tries to scale. Veigar bot lane, because of how good Cage is, and because you have a teammate who has crowd control, if Senna lands her W, that's going to guarantee Veigar Cage stun and Veigar QW combo and Senna landing for auto attacks. Root turns into stun, turns into every single spell from Veigar lands, turns into if he's level 6, you're definitely dead, unless Braum is in the way. Veigar cannot hit confirm his own stuns. Well, I mean, if he lands a stun, he can confirm it with Q and W, but in mid lane, the cage is big enough that you can dodge the edge of the cage and the W, and unless, like, Lee Sin runs up and kicks you into the wall, you can just dodge the stuff. Whereas Veigar, again, in bot lane, W actually is a functional skill and has a really, really high accuracy rate. So I think W damage, especially early, is really, really, really bot lane skewed as a thing, and I think that's actually a pretty important change here. So this, to me, actually probably is the heaviest lifting of this change list for nerfing bot lane, but I think it's a very, very good change overall. Next, we have Vi. So Vi is not a huge solo queue problem. She's certainly, again, one of the big pro play champions. Right now in pro, Vi is roughly 50-50 between Divine Sunderer and Radiant Virtue as her mythic of choice, looking at 13.5 data. And so it's basically saying, well, we're going to basically nerf Radiant Virtue builds, and Divine Sunderer builds going into more AD is going to be relatively the same. So it's basically flat damage down and AD ratio up, flat damage down and AD ratio up. Keep in mind, this is a total AD ratio here on the E, so the fact this is 0 damage is fake because you're getting 20% of your total AD as functional bonus damage here on the ability, plus the attack reset. So here is Vi's Q damage before and after. Keep in mind, I'm using a stand-in of 5, which is 1 stat shard, 5 to 260 bonus AD. By level 18, that's going to be, 4 AD items in the champion, basically. 4 to 5, obviously, approaching full build, sure, but you can see that this is, right, plus 0.2 bonus AD ratio, minus 20 damage. This is 100 bonus AD equals. And then if you look over here, it's minus 30 damage with a 0.1 AD ratio increase. 300 total AD equalizes. You're going to have around 130 herself level 18, so 170 from items. These are certainly going to be nerfs, right? 170 bonus AD to equalize takes a very, very long time. 100 equalize is not too bad, but it's still 2 items here. These are definitely nerfs to Vi, but they are less of nerfs to AD builds. So here's Vi's Q damage before and after. Here's Vi's E damage before and after. Keep in mind that the AD ratio growth ends up being fine because you're only losing 5 damage. And then once you finally max it out, yeah, okay, sure. But if you have these amount of bonus AD, right? If you're at, like, 2-3 items at this point, again, your base AD is 100. That's giving you 10 damage back. And then if you have, almost 200 bonus AD in items, you get, most of the way back here. So E is relatively flat. Maybe I'm slightly overestimating how much bonus AD you get in the champion, but you can bring this down a little bit. But you can kind of see what the shape is here. It's a very small nerf, but not a very big one, as long as you're building attack damage on Vi. Wukong gets a small nerf. We have another 2 attack damage or 2 armor nerf for junglers here in this patch. We had it for Lee Sin. We had it for Wukong. Okay, that was kind of it, to be fair. Either way, 2 attack damage is down. W cooldown is getting a less incentive. So W max second was actually a higher win rate, but less common build for him. This actually will probably bring W and E max into sort of equal power levels. But 22 to 14 instead of 22 to 12, and then just simply a 5 attack speed drop off of Nimbus Strike. This, of course, matters somewhat for his top lane 1v1 trades, but it should matter, I would argue, even more for his jungle. This should be a very lightly jungle-skewed nerf to the champion, though not a very big one. And we can look at the his base AD before and after, down... wait, I need to actually drag this all the way down, I believe. I did something weird. Hang on. I didn't drag this down, that's why. There we go. Here's the actual math. Here's his base AD before and after. Here's the attacks per second with E on before and after, assuming you max it second because it's the more common build for the champion. Then you can look at his auto attack DPS as a result, down 6 to 4%. And again, if you're maxing it last, the W cooldown, which you're going to barely feel. In higher elo, people are more aware that they should be maxing W second. It's still going to be pretty good, don't get me wrong, but which means if you're doing that, you're going to feel it from level 8 through 13 as a result of these changes. Next is Yasuo. I think actually some pretty smart changes to Yasuo overall. He is actually early game skewed as a champion. Yes, he scales pretty hard. With crit chance, he can do a lot of damage, but turns out it's actually really hard to teamfight on Yasuo. His late game is not as good as the early game. He tends to win games by snowballing early on, and his late game actually isn't quite as good. His win rate does fall off with game time, statistically. So a late game skewed buff to his shield amount. We'll have the actual data table here in a second, as well as a small rescript to how his E actually bumps his damage. Maximum stat count goes to 4, and it actually scales the total damage, not just the base damage. So it'll scale the bonus AD ratio and the AP ratio, but it's not going to be quite as much in the early game. We can talk about how much damage that means overall with this table. So here is Yasuo's actual shield before and after. You will feel it from level 5 onwards, and it pretty quickly approaches about 20% more shield for all of late game team fighting. Of course, his base health regen, his base health, none of those have changed. The value of shield, none of those have changed, but overall a bigger shield. Keep in mind that his R refreshes the passive shield, so if he burns through it and then he presses R, he gets it back. That's going to be 100 health both ways. That does happen. So keep in mind, definitely a pretty meaningful buff to get to this champion. The one that's cooler, though, in my opinion, is the rescript to how his E works. So instead of being 50% more base damage, and then plus the 0.2 bonus AD ratio, it is 60 to 100% more total damage, which can be up to almost 50% more damage on the E as a mechanic overall. I think it's actually pretty cool. The max damage of the E is still not terribly high. The max base damage of this is 90, by the way, so it becomes 180 plus 0.4 bonus AD. Like, it still barely exists, and that's, you know, fully capped out level 18 here, but glad to see it just be a little bit less garbage. I think it's generally a positive thing here overall, so can't complain. We then have a nerf to Zeri. Again, I tried to hold off on nerfing Zeri for most of the year to let the bot lane meta shake up more, and honestly, she had a lot of close competition. Aphelios for a while was gaining on her. Varus was tied with her for a while. Lucian came and went a little bit. So, but by 13.5, she was very clearly the go-to bot laner. She was like 20 percentage points above any other AD carry pick banned. So Zeri is the one lone marksman nerf here for the patch. Worth noting that 13.6 directly nerfed her most common mythic, her most common keystone, and her most common, I believe, third item in Bloodthirster. So the 13.6 AD carry nerfs did disproportionately hurt her. That said, I do not believe that that was going to make pros change their behavior. So ultimately, okay, Zeri, go lose a little bit of win rate, be a little bit less powerful, and let's have a little bit more breathing room for every other AD carry in pro play, because there is a wealth of pretty equally viable options down there. I think it's a pretty cool change overall. So 5 health growth down, less damage against, or less shield absorption against shields, and then a little bit less burst damage on activating R is a pretty minor change. But again, just sort of minor nerfs here to Zeri. So here is her total health before and after. This is not counting shield with Mythic Bath. This is not counting the amount of shield she can get out of Bloodthirster. Just her total HP before and after, and then the amount of burst damage you can get out of R because of the bonus AD ratio nerf. So that is the patch. In terms of champions, we then have stuff that I'm not going to do the math on. Death's Dance getting reverted back to what it was in 13.1 micro patch, I believe it was. Or maybe it was 13.1 itself. I don't remember. Really, either way, early on in the year, Death's Dance minus 10. It's going back, right? So it's minus 10 AD, plus 15 haste, minus 5 armor. Back to getting the Call of Field's Warhammer on the build path overall. I believe it's the same total cost. Rejoice. Old Death Dance is back, with the exception that the heal on kill is still lower. The, I believe, base amount of healing slash the AD ratio on the healing has remained nerfed, which I think is actually a good change overall. I like the damage cleansing. That's a really cool mechanic. I think actually it's pretty healthy. Pun not intended, though a good one. I think it's like a really, really cool mechanic, the damage cleanse, the damage delay. I'm glad it's not a massive heal, because I think that's actually the most frustrating part of the ability, is that they kill someone else, their health goes up because someone else engaged the fight. That feels pretty bad. Catalyst of Eons ends up being a sort of clever nerf to Rod of Ages. Rod of Ages was slated for a nerf, and the way to do this was simply saying, you know what, we're just going to nerf Catalyst. That the recall timing is the same as Lost Chapter or Noon Quiver. It's going to be a 1300 gold recall, so and this is going to be same gold efficiency, by the way. 200 gold for 75 HP is like 100% gold efficient, considering that Catalyst is a good item. That is a nerf to the item, because you're hitting the spike later, despite being gold efficient. Like, no one wants to stack 5 ruby crystals, right? It's not a good build to stack 5 ruby crystals. You want to actually complete epics, you want to complete legendaries, and so getting a completion later is overall a nerf to the item. Okay, great. Move on from there. This ends up being a slight buff to Abyssal Mask, just gets 50 health for free, so 133 gold worth of stats for free on that champion, or on that item. Rod of Ages gets a different combined cost. Again, if you ended up recalling at, you know, entire Roa, there's no difference here to the item, but a very, very light touch here to Catalyst as a result. Other change is a mechanics update to Grievous Wounds. Now, even if you deal damage to a shield, I believe this will also apply to dealing someone who is invulnerable. You will now apply Grievous Wounds because you actually afflicted them with something, because you actually dealt something to them, even if you didn't actually deal damage. This is functionally under the hood. this basically just, what this is moving the logic from on deal damage post mitigation to on deal damage pre mitigation. But of course, if the damage gets mitigated, you don't deal damage post mitigation, right? You just simply lower a shield value. And so on a technical level, if you weren't dealing damage post mitigation, it would never apply the logic to apply grievous wounds on Oblivion Orb, Merlenomicon, Chemtech, Putrefier, etc. Now it's on deal damage pre-apply, or on deal damage pre-mitigation, or damage pre-apply, I forget. I think it's pre-mitigation. Is like the technical name internally, and it's like, yeah, I am attempting to deal damage to you. Now, before we look at the mitigation, apply this debuff, which I think is, again, totally reasonable. I think this is actually a good change for the item. This, to me, is how I think the item should work. A lot of the changes are things like this, where someone's like, hey, there's something weird. Do we think we should change the game? It should function this way. And people are like, yeah, it should function this way. And it's like, okay, well, we're going to ship that change. So this is not meant to like, we really wanted to find a clever way to buff Oblivion Orb. It's just like, nah, the items just should work this way to match player expectations. So I think it's a good change. ARAM adjustments, they're going for specifically tuned abilities. So Scion gets half lifesteal in his passive. Karthus passive lasts 2 fewer seconds. And Veigar E cooldown goes up by a solid 3 seconds. I think it's cool to try some stuff out here. I think it's actually pretty neat. I have been... My internal belief around ARAM balance, I think has changed over time. Because initially, for a long time, I really disliked... things that would change champion feel between the Summoner's Rift experience and the ARAM experience. But ultimately, I've come around on it a fair bit because, you know what? It's a different game mode. It has different rules. There's a good portion of players who, they only play ARAM. And that's totally fine. That's great. Good. I'm happy if you're an ARAM player. But I think, yeah, sort of taking off some of the constraints, saying, nah, you can kind of balance champions in more specific ways. I still wouldn't want to change how mechanics work. Like, that to me is still, like, my current frame of thinking is I wouldn't want to be like, oh, actually, Ashe W doesn't apply her passive, or, like, Ashe has an entirely new passive, would feel weird. Now, there's some champions that, like, oh, Talon E is, like, unusable. That's maybe the only spot where it's like, actually, maybe it does make sense for like Bard Portal and Talon E and things like this to just like, actually, they have an entirely new skill on ARAM. Have fun. Like, that actually weirdly is kind of reasonable to me, but like, if the ability does function, I think, you know, I wouldn't want to see like an actual mechanic change, but like, yeah, the cooldown's just longer, the lifesteal is lowering the passive. Like, I think those are actually pretty reasonable, so I'm actually really glad giving it more thought that Riot's going this way with ARAM systems. I think it's actually a pretty cool thing. Clash is coming. Cool beans here. Some tech coming in for off-screen pings. So regardless of where it is, you will see at the edge of your screen the enemy missing ping. If these pings are relatively close to your champion, you will see assist me, caution, on the way, retreat, and hold. So I think pretty cool stuff here around communication being stronger. I do think a lot of the smart pings, like the on the map pings, are really, really, really good. There's a bunch that like don't matter. Like, I don't need someone to ping my alive timer. I don't need someone to ping that I have a stopwatch that I didn't use. That's for Flame, and I know I'm bad. I died. I screwed up. I'm aware. But I think these are really, really good pings, and I'm glad that there's some updates going in to make these cooler. I think this is really great. Purpose of disruptive behavior detection, which is cool stuff. Challenges can see friend data on their profile card. Some other bug fixes around Clash stuff. That's nice. Also, by the way, doing some new stuff with competitive. So non-unanimous surrender pre-15 minutes is now going to be available to everyone in about 3 days. Well, it's going to be 2.5 days, I guess, at time of recording. This will be very interesting. But I will say, as someone who very, very regularly votes no, this will lower my win rate when I play ranked. Actually, maybe it'll raise it because I'll be on the winning team of the laning phase a bit more often. I don't know. So my understanding is they have done a lot of like investigation in the data here. And it's like, again, I'm making this up because I don't remember. It was something like a failed 4-to-1 surrender vote in ranked had like a 97% loss rate or something. Again, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was like a surprisingly high rate of like, obviously a non-zero number of games would have been turned around and won, but it was like, oh, this is an extremely high number where like I saw it and I was like, as the guy who says no on the surrender vote, I get it. I accept. And again, my win rate might go down 3% or something as a result, long term, because again, I'm the no voter here and I'm bad in lane. But I can also totally understand this change. I think it's overall reasonable, and it is what it is. Also, very excited about this. I think this is really, really cool. So basically, when playing normal draft on these servers, autofill is gone. You must, everyone in your party must use unique primary assignments. And then if you chose a primary role that is popular, you must pick a secondary role that needs player. So if this is like, oh, jungle and support are unpopular, anyone who queues top, mid, or bot needs to pick jungle, support, or fill as their secondary, which I think is like, oh, that's really cool. I like that. I think that's a really, really clever change. And so you never have an autofill. You just always have, at least you're playing your secondary role. I think it's actually really, really clever. I think it's a really, really cool change. And I hope it does work out, because I think it's actually really, really smart. So cool stuff here. 64-bit client coming up. Showcase milestones, auto claims, a bunch of bug fixes. I want to see if any of my stuff is in here. I think I had one bug fix here somewhere. I'm going to look for it. Look, this one actually was technically not a bug. This is actually Ash's E. So this was functionally designer art. This was, hey, I cast Ash E. When the E reveals someone, play a particle on them, I'm just gonna take the Ash passive critical strike effect as that particle. And obviously it makes sense to not use that particle twice, but that was like an intentional choice. And so it's like, okay, well, it no longer plays that particle. I thought it was interesting, but when I saw it, this was not my change. I fixed this bug. This was actually relatively simple. You can copy the logic from Anathemas, but basically, Ransom's Omen says so it's an item. So it says, okay, as an item, on take damage pre-apply. So when I take damage, right before you apply it, if the damage comes from a critical strike, reduce it by 20%. Right, so that's the math, by the way. Is Random's Omen is like, or whatever the number actually is, I don't know if it's 20% or not, but let's say it's 20%. It just says, hey, if the damage is critical strike, 20% less. This is now changed for the logic. Says, okay, if it's a critical strike, if damage type is not equal to true damage, 20% less. What this basically meant was like, if you had a Kraken Slayer, or if you had Silver Bolts, and you crit on the auto that you applied Kraken Slayer, or the auto that you applied Silver Bolts, Random would say, oh, I took damage, I took a crit, lower all of this by 20%. Now it says, oh, I took a crit, lower non-true damage by 20%. This is exactly what you expected the change to be, of course, but like, hey, it was fun to like look into how the item worked, and that was, you know, a functionally add an extra if statement, and then off we went, and it worked perfectly. So yay, I fixed a bug. Cool beans there. Good stuff. Hooray for me. I've got several bug fixes, including a 14-year-old bug shipping in 13.8. Stay tuned. I'm excited to have changed that. Alrighty, so patch 13.7 TLDR. This is MSI patch version 1. This is looking at a lot of the really big overperformers across pro play this year. Stuff that is still really, really top. Looking at, you know, playoffs 13.5 across all the top regions, saying, okay, let's check out the meta a little bit coming in for MSI, give a couple of new things that are worth playing, and bring down a couple things that were really over-prioritized. So let's get into it. Alistar simply has room for buffs, and so gets a, you know, solid base armor, base health growth, or sorry, base health increase. Nothing too scary here. Annie is the #1 champion pro play right now, about 100% pick ban, but still #1 champion pro play. So a support focused nerf where she is the most, I would say, overpowered as a champion. So 2 seconds on the shield and 20 off the shield as well. Should be a pretty meaningful nerf, and I think will bring Annie support into a relatively balanced state. Rip my Freelo, I am a proud Annie support abuser. Azir is getting somewhere between 3 and 5% win rate this patch, is my belief on this champion. Getting 3 armor is a moderate durability increase. Getting 1% attack speed growth is a 0 to 8% DPS increase via attack speed. This is a mostly feels good change around passive duration and cast range of 200. Conquering Sands mana cost and W changes, and W mana cost is mostly around signaling to players. They should be maxing W, with an exception that there is a flat 10 damage increase on W by about level 9, 10, 11, and it stays there for that point in time. And the skill recommender itself will actually now, as a designer override, now tells you to max W instead. Again, I think this could be anywhere between 3 and 5% win rate to W max Azir. If players do not get the hint and they do not realize that they should be maxing W and they still max Q, they're going to be met with a larger mana cost and even less damage because the flat scaling is even lower until you put more points into W. So there is a road where his win rate goes down if players are not doing their ability orders correctly. Stab range down a little bit on Q, basically just makes the Q line up with W auto attack range, but of course is a nerf to his damage. Overall though, outside of this, pretty much everything here in the change list is a strict buff to Azir as a champion, again to the tune of 3 to 5% win rate. Grays get some crit bonus. This is 1/12 more damage on every crit auto attack. Pretty good stuff here overall. 20, 10, and 0 seconds on the R cooldown should be a solid buff there as well. Grays should be in a very good spot post-patch, and overall a pretty good champion. Kalista gets a very reserved 0.25 attack damage growth. Keep in mind that she uses attack damage not only for her basic attacks, but also her Q and E are total AD ratios. It actually does triple duty and buffs all 3 of those parts of her kit. This could be up to 1% win rate. We will see. But definitely a buff to the champion. Also, I think this one's pretty fun. Basically, instead of Kalista being locked up for 4 seconds and her target being locked up for the next 8, just both locked up for 8 seconds together. Then you can go on your merry way. The overall ceremony is much, much faster. And honestly, I think actually it looks better now overall because Azir, or not Azir, sorry, Kalista actually is part of the ceremony. Now when she throws the spear down, the target champion immediately goes into the death animation and Kalista goes into the channel. So that she's channeling during the death and rebirth animation, and the target doesn't have 4 seconds of mostly standing around doing nothing, waiting for the death animation to go through. So overall, a fast ceremony, and I think overall a positive thing. Hopefully it feels good, let me know, but I think it's a pretty good thing. Kalista gets a 5% AP ratio buff here. Onto her passive, a very small AD ratio nerf onto R, but an attack speed ratio buff on R that should keep Blade of the Ruined King in about the same spot as it was before. Kha'Zix is moving away from W evolve and into Q evolve, less a slow bot and more frequently what would have isolated targets for the Q. Should be very, very nice, and I'm excited for a change like this, as well as just some more room to navigate with R in the team fight, which is cool. More time to recast it functionally. You're not invisible for longer, it's just you have more time to recast it. Lee Sin loses 2 attack damage and 2 armor. Moving on. Olaf loses a little bit of attack speed in the early game. This is up to 8% less total attacks, or 8% less total attack speed at level 1, trending off towards the exact same by level 18, of course. And then Undertow is -5 AD, or -5 damage, which is going to be felt a little bit here as well, and should be a appropriately sized nerf to Olaf. Rammus loses a 5% increased total armor on the W rank up. This ends up being 10% less total armor at level 18 on the character. Moderate nerf here, not a huge one, but trying to get Rammus below 54% win rate in low MMR. Sejuani, less monster damage, but specifically only to Dragon, Herald, and Baron. 1 second increased cooldown on the Q and 10 second increased cooldown on the R. Pretty small nerfs, but just trying to push Sejuani down as we nerf kind of all 4 S tier junglers right now in pro play, or the 4 like obvious top tier junglers in pro play. Thresh, sadly, with 50 ability haste, could get a a 3 second cooldown on Q. Throughout like half of which the target was stunned by the Q itself. Definitely far too short. So less refund on the Q makes it less aggressive when it gets too much of haste, and so that's change seeing people. Overall, a pretty positive change. Veigar, his AP ratio now being pushed into the champion, actually leveling up more. In each case, rank 4 is the same AP ratio, and rank 5 is a higher AP ratio. I think this is especially a bot lane focused nerf because W is almost unhittable in mid lane, but is very, very, very hittable in bot lane when like Morgana lands a Dark Binding, or Leona lands a stun, or Nautilus lands a hook, or whatever. It's very easy to hit confirm all your spells and land the W. And so W getting the biggest nerf by being an ability that is going to be rank 1 until level 8, and losing 1/3 of its AP ratio, of which the AP ratio is carrying a lot of the damage, because you are stacking AP on the champion. Should actually be a pretty well felt nerf, and I think is thankfully very bot lane skewed, and I'm happy about that. You can't hide E inside terrain, that's good stuff. And then R, of course, again, AP ratio scales with rank. Vi is losing Q damage until you get to 100 bonus AD. E is losing damage to get to, I believe it is 300 total AD, which is going to take more items than Vault Breaker. But keep in mind that because this is a total AD ratio, and this only down 10 damage, but you get a 0.1 AD ratio increase at 100 total AD, which is like fewer than one item. It's like Caulfield's Warhammer plus like level 7, E will just be doing more damage than before. So not really much of a nerf here to the champion. A very late one to tank builds. Radiant Virtue was about half of her builds in pro play. This should lower her priority a little bit. She doesn't really nerf too much for solo queue. Wukong, -2 armor. If you were to max W, minus or increase of 2 seconds in the cooldown, as well as 5% attack speed off of Nimbus Strike. Definitely a couple of very small hits, but over 1% win rate loss here to jungle almost for certain. Probably 1% win rate loss to top lane here as well, but again, nerfing Wukong out of the top spot in the jungle, or the top spots in the jungle to shake things up. He also gets a late game focus buff onto his shield, as well as some E damage. This ends up being around, I believe, this ends up being like up to 50% more total damage through the E if you get to fully stacked. This is not a very high damage ability. It goes from like 190 to like 290. It's not like that big of a deal at like max damage, but it's something. And then again, passive is up a pretty substantial, like 20% or so from like level 11 onwards, which is a pretty big team fight durability increase. Zeri loses 5 health growth, as well as a little bit of shield absorption, as well as some bonus AD ratio onto the R here as well. This is, of course, a pretty light nerf. It's just the burst damage on activation. This, of course, only matters sometimes, but 5 health growth, of course, going to be nerf here as well. Zeri was very clearly the #1 AD carry in pro play, so well-deserved of a nerf. Death's Dance mostly reverted back to the old version from before 13.1. It has the ability haste, it has less AD, it has less armor, but the ability haste is back. Still nerfed is the healing on takedown. That is still down, but overall, I think a reasonable nerf to Death's Dance. A reasonable change back. The healing was a reasonable nerf to Death's Dance. That's coming back as ability haste item, I think, is overall a positive, and I'm glad we're reverting the item back to this state. Kettles of Eons is giving you 75 more health for 200 gold. This is 100% gold efficient, but that is not technically a good thing for an item that's already efficient. Moving towards 100% is generally going to be a nerf to an item like this. It means your power spike is later. It means you can't get an 1100 gold recall. When your opponent can't get Lost Chapter, but you can get Catalyst. Rod of Ages is cheaper to make good with this, with no stat changes. Abyssal Mask actually just gets 50 free health. Congratulations, Abyssal Mask gets strictly buffed. Cool beans. Good item. I like that item a lot. Grievous Wounds on items now applies before shields. Before, if you were invulnerable or you were shielded, Grievous Wounds would not apply to you. Now it will apply no matter if the damage is... I mean, if you don't even hit them, I believe if they dodge, you won't apply Grievous Wounds, but if it's shielded or they're invulnerable, you will, in fact, apply to them, and congratulations, you get to do the thing. Hooray. I think this is just design-wise a good change. ARM-specific adjustments are in. Cool stuff. Clash is coming up. Fun stuff there as well. Off-screen pings onto your screen if people ping relevant stuff relatively nearby to your champion. I think cool stuff as well there. Behavioral systems updates. Challenge updates. Unanimous Surrender is available now in ranked games before 20 minutes. Also, trying something out in normal draft that you can, autofill is removed. You just have to queue for a high priority role if you are queuing for a low priority role as your primary. I think it's really, really cool. I dig this a lot. I think it's going to be pretty exciting. So looking forward to this testing well and then being rolled out elsewhere, because I think getting rid of autofill is a really, really cool thing. And I'm glad Riot is trying something here, and I think it's going to be really nice. So thanks for watching. That's the patch rundown. Stay awesome. See you next time. Bye-bye.